Welcome back to our continuing discussion related to scientific narcissism. Science is only as good as the scientist conducting the investigation, and in many instances you have self-serving science. And in those instances, you have science that is meeting some personal need of the scientist. This may be fueled by demographics, it might be fueled by cognitive dispositions, emotional factors, or some sort of external reward. And the result is that you have part science. So you have part knowledge, and then you have decision making that is based on part science. This is a forensic issue because you have a number of legal determinations that are often made based upon a belief in a particular scientific assertion. So we are going to be looking at this issue with respect to the CCR5 science and the assertions that have been made about the genetic mutations conferring this sort of genetic superiority or superior disease resistance or superior cognitive ability. What we are going to look at is some research coming out of NIH that challenges this idea of the mutation conferring this overall genetic disease resistant superiority. And so what is asserted in the research from NIH is that the vulnerabilities and the strengths that people have with respect to the CCR5 dynamic, those things are context dependent. And so in some instances, you have a situation where this mutation confers something that could be considered a strength or a benefit. In some instances, however, that mutation presents a deficit and a problem, and we're going to look at that. And let's just clear up some of these numbers before we go forward here. It's important to remember that the CCR5 mutation, when it is complete, those individuals make up about 10% of the population in Europe. And you see higher numbers when you go higher, Iceland, for instance. But when you look at the total population of the Earth, you are talking about basically 1% of the entire population of the Earth. One of the things that seems to be emerging is a demand to create environments that are more conducive to the individuals that make up this 1%. And so you see these environmentalism demands that are going on from less sunlight, a demand for less sunlight, a demand for not breathing so that you're not releasing carbon, a demand for less heat and more cold, a demand for mass extinctions of insects such as mosquitoes. And all of these things are tied together in terms of creating a situation that, if you look across the board, across the planet, would change things so that they would be more conducive to the 1%. However, these things are not conducive to the remaining population. And so you can see where this is a big issue. And so for a large percentage of the population, there is a need for more sunlight. There is a need for that exchange between the green spaces and human beings or mammals. And so exchanging that carbon for that oxygen. There is a need for more warmth for some people, even though some people feel more comfortable with more cold. And also, we've already talked about it, that the mosquitoes actually serve a purpose in terms of the entire ecosystem. And so what is happening is, with respect to this, is this dynamic of scientific narcissism, because you have some science that is being skewed in order to meet the needs of this 1%. Now, the scientists may not be completely aware of this when they are doing the science, but that is one of the implications of some of the science that has been coming out. But we are going to look at some of the information coming from the NIH related to this CCR5 mutation that calls into question the extent to which this mutation is beneficial overall. And we're just going to revisit the controversy related to the genetically modified mosquitoes and the mass extinction event. The idea behind the research was to cut the risk related to Zika and West Nile virus. Now, this is very important for a certain group of people, that 1% that we were talking about. And so you have a situation where you have a group of people that have that CCR5 mutation, and that CCR5 mutation makes them more vulnerable to West Nile virus and for fatalities associated with the West Nile virus. And so therefore that CCR5 mutation may be beneficial for something like HIV. However, it is not beneficial in terms of issues like West Nile virus. And so when you start talking about getting rid of all of these mosquitoes, creating this mass extinction event, this is basically being created to benefit that 1%, because other individuals, that other 99%, don't have the same outcomes because they actually do have the normal CCR5 dynamic going on. As you can recall, there was some scientific controversy about this mass extinction event related to the mosquitoes. The program already started in Brazil. What the scientists have been concerned about is in creating this genetically modified strain of these mosquitoes, that you might create a hybrid mosquito population by accident. And by creating these mutations, you might actually create a more robust population of these hybrid mosquitoes. What's also noteworthy is that these programs are going on in places like Brazil, Florida, Mexico. That's not where the individuals, for the most part, live that have that CCR5 mutation. And so for the most part, the individuals who would be most impacted by this actually live in places where there is less risk. And so you have a situation of changing an entire environment in order to be more conducive to the needs of a population that does not even really exist in that space. Now, of course, there are some individuals there, but the majority of people that live in those spaces, they do not have that CCR5 mutation. And so it's not as beneficial to them to eradicate this mosquito population as it would be for those who live in Iceland or who live in Northern Europe. And this is just additional discussion related to this laboratory strain that was created in Cuba and this formation of these hybrid populations of mosquitoes of Cuba, Mexico, and Brazil. In our previous discussion, we looked at the benefits that have been asserted by the scientific community related to the CCR5 mutation, that deletion. And there is a big push for this understanding of seeing this as a benefit. However, according to the National Institutes of Health, National Institute of Allergy and Infectious Diseases, what we have here is an assertion that the CCR5 deficiency actually increases risk of symptomatic West Nile virus infection. Now, this is some very old research. So this is from 2006, and this is coming out of the Journal of Experimental Medicine. This is posted in the United States National Library of Medicine, National Institutes of Health website. So this is where this research is coming from. So one thing these researchers point out is that the CCR5 mutation originated in Northern Europe. So that is the belief, and that it forms 1% of the population of those identified in the United States as white. Now, of course, we don't have any lines of demarcation to clearly determine where white begins and where it ends, but this is the science that we have so far. And so in the United States, you have 1% of this particular population that completely lacks any CCR5 functioning. However, they are pointing out that the individuals appear to be healthy. Now, because individuals with this mutation have been presented as individuals in generally good health, there has been the assertion that this dynamic is superior in terms of disease resistance. However, these researchers are pointing out that this defective CCR5 dynamic is a risk factor for symptomatic West Nile infection. And it has been basically the first genetic risk factor identified for this disease. And so you can see how, even though this may be beneficial for those who have a heritage growing out of Northern Europe and actually may be residing in Northern Europe, this deletion is going to be a risk for those individuals who live in spaces where mosquitoes are prevalent. And so, yes, it may confer some benefit in terms of HIV. However, it is not going to confer benefit in terms of something that is environmental, mosquitoes. The same thing applies to SARS-CoV, which also is related to this CCR5 mutation dynamic. And so even though it may seem beneficial to have that mutation, or that's what's being presented, that mutation is going to serve as a liability for individuals in places where, for instance, malaria is prevalent. And in the event that someone might think that the research finding is by chance, the researchers have laid out 6 facts that point to this not being by chance and that this being a major issue for consideration. And the final offering is that when they looked at the research with respect to mice, they found that those with this mutation uniformly had a fatal outcome. And this research is specifically related to those individuals who are homozygous for this particular mutation. And that means they have 2 identical mutations with respect to this particular gene. So the researchers summarized this by indicating that this particular dynamic, this mutation, is a strong host genetic risk factor for symptomatic, laboratory confirmed West Nile infection. And this data on these genetics imply that this CCR5 plays an opposite role in HIV and in West Nile infection. And so where it is a benefit in one situation, it is a significant liability in another situation. And they also offer that there are implications in terms of potential safety for CCR5 blocking agents. And so there are a number of studies related to these blocking agents for the treatment of HIV and AIDS and other diseases. Now, this may be beneficial for those individuals who do not live in spaces where there is the potential for significant mosquito exposure, because those individuals who are using these blocking agents may create a situation where if they are infected by West Nile virus, they may not be able to mount an appropriate immune response and may be at greater risk for suffering a fatality. And so this CCR5 is really a double-edged sword. In closing, the researchers also point out that their data suggests that immunocompromised individuals may be particularly susceptible to symptomatic West Nile infection if CCR5 function is missing or blocked. And so this can be a major issue. They are also indicating that those who have acquired immunodeficiency syndrome need close monitoring if they are using these antagonistic substances. And so again, you have a situation where this CCR5 mutation may be beneficial in some situations. However, you have a situation where it's also serving as a liability in other situations. And so this calls into question all of this narcissistic scientism that is going on, that is fueling at this point some scientific racism. And so you have to be very careful when consuming research, and always take into consideration the position of the person doing the research, because there may be some bias going on with the researcher. The researcher may not even be aware of the bias, but science does take into account the fact that bias may be present and that it may skew the overall data. Remember, knowledge is power. Take care. See you soon.